Hello. Welcome. Thank you for coming to today's Open Mind program on helping kids choose kindness. I'm Dr. Yalda T. Uhls. I'm the founder of the Center for Scholars and Storytellers, which is based at UCLA. And it is my honor and privilege to welcome today's esteemed discussants who will come on in a little bit. Dr. Lisa Damour, best-selling author in the press all the time, does wonderful work on adolescence, and Dr. Kevin Johnson, who's an addiction psychiatrist, has written a book on transitioning, and also is a consultant with the nonprofit, the Jed Foundation. For those of you with us for the first time, you saw those great upcoming programs. The Open Mind is a community lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders at the intersection of science and culture for meaningful and relevant conversations about mental health issues, never more needed. We are honored to join the UCLA's Friend of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors in sponsoring today's Open Mind program. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. The program will run for approximately 1 hour, and the last segment, around 15 minutes, is reserved for your questions. When you want to ask a question, if you want to ask the speaker a question or all of us, just type it into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have a lot of people registered, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible in the time allotted. You can stick them in anytime. You don't have to wait for the Q&A portion. And if we can, we'll answer them along the way, but at the very least, we'll answer them in the last 15 minutes. Today's program is being recorded. It's going to be available for viewing on the Friends of Semel YouTube channel. You can find that on their website, friendsofsemelinstitute.org. You'll also find a library of past Open Mind programs, videos from the WOW, the Resnick Friends fundraising event, and just recently posted, which we were honored to be part of, photos and videos from the Teen Advisory Council's inaugural Gen Z Wellness Summit. I was honored to moderate the panel on social media. So please be sure to check the calendar of upcoming Open Mind events, special events including the Open Mind Film Festival for high school students, which has been going on, I think, for 3 or 4 years. It's going to be held in person this year on Sunday, April 21st. Okay, so now let's give a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Lisa Damour and Dr. Kevin Johnson. Hello, welcome. Thank you guys both for joining me for this really important conversation. I really only shared a teeny weeny bit about each of you, so I would love you each to tell the audience a little bit more about yourself. So, Dr. Johnson, could you start?
Certainly. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. So yeah, my name is Dr. Kevin Johnson. So I am a consultant for the Jed Foundation, and I'm also an addiction psychiatrist. My official title is Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at the SUNY Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York. I'm also a staff psychiatrist at Crouse Addiction Treatment Services in Syracuse, New York. I use both he, him, and they, them pronouns. I mostly use he and him pronouns. Identify as Hawaiian and African American. Now, while I mostly work with adults in my day-to-day life, I also have worked exclusively with youth and teenagers who are gender diverse and trans through the Yale Gender Clinic a few years back, which is based in New Haven, Connecticut. And I also served as an editor for the textbook Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, a resource for the transgender community, which came out. So, well, the second edition came out a couple years ago. And I'm also a writer, researcher, publisher of numerous publications and books on mental health and substance use in the transgender and gender diverse community.
Oh, we are really excited to learn more about your expertise. It's clearly you have a deep understanding of this particular population, and I'm sure some of the issues that they face in terms of our topic, bullying, and ways to support them. And
Happy to
Dr.
be
Lisa
here.
Damour, right?
So happy to be here.
Yes, me too. And Dr. Damour, please share your background.
Sure. So I'm thrilled to be with you all. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my work focuses on adolescence. And I continue to practice, but I also work very hard to make resources available to people everywhere using a variety of different media. So I have 3 New York Times bestselling books about raising adolescents. I have a podcast called Ask Lisa, The Psychology of Parenting, where every week we answer questions from parents. I write often. I've written 80 pieces for the New York Times about teenagers. And I have a website that is a huge kind of archive of resources for families. Much of the content is free. I do a huge amount of work for UNICEF and create a lot of content for them around raising teenagers. And I also have a subscription service called Untangling 10 to 20 with deep dives into the kinds of questions and topics that families raising teenagers are dealing with.
That's incredible. And you're speaking my language, sharing resources with people who aren't in the ivory tower and in a way that they can use them. And 10 to 20 is a great span. And I wonder if you guys are both aware that the National Academy of Science, I'm sure you are, has defined adolescence as ages 10 to 25. And I wondered if you wanted to speak to that, Lisa, in terms of that span of sort of why it starts so early and ends sort of later.
Sure. So let's start with the early side. And I do think it's important that we help people understand that adolescence begins around age 10 or 11. And that has always been true. This is not a modern creation. If you look back 100 years in the scientific literature, we have marked the onset of adolescence around that time. And we do so because for most kids, puberty is underway by then, whether it's visible outwardly, the neurological activity that goes with puberty is underway. So their brains are remodeling, their brains are changing. What this looks like in your kitchen is that your kid is having a lot of meltdowns. And so, that is typical and expectable part of the beginning of adolescence. And the remodeling of the brain continues all the way until around age 25. And what's happening in the brain is that it is throughout the brain being upgraded. It is becoming faster, more powerful, more efficient. This process starts in the lower order regions where the emotions are housed. And so kids can get very, very amped up emotionally while they await the higher order regions being fully upgraded. This is where their perspective maintaining systems are located. The way we understand it is that it takes until 25 for these frontal lobe systems to be fully, fully upgraded. Let me just say one more thing, and then I want to hear Kevin's take on all this because I love that we probably have similar but also different perspectives on this thing. Um, it's not that teenagers' brains don't work well or are not developed until they're 25. I think that's something I always find a little bit hard to hear, especially I'm like, look at this AP paper this kid just wrote. Like, tell me that's not a developed brain. I think a better way to think about it is that their frontal lobes, their ability to maintain perspective and clear thinking, is more readily knocked offline by the comparatively powerful emotion centers until about age 25 when things come more into balance. So when teenagers are calm, in a controlled situation, they reason as well as any of us. It's only when they become very, very activated that their reasoning can become quite compromised. And that seems to level out by about 25.
I would actually add even it's compromised, but part of it is also adaptive because um, when they are leaving your home and they're going out into the world, it's very risky. It's very scary. And if we were put back there with our adult brains, we might actually not want to leave. So the fact they sort of need that ability to respond to risk and reward at a much higher level than adults because we can't remember what it was like, but leaving the home you've always lived in if you've had grown up in a home and going out into the world is a pretty scary thing. And I have a 21 and a 24-year-old. I can attest to that. Kevin, I would love to hear from you, sort of with the population that you work with. What do you see around? Is adolescence 10 to 25? Is that, or obviously there are gender dysphoria is happening. There's different issues.
Mhm.
Does that happen sooner, later? What are you seeing? Or is there no one answer? I'm sure.
Yeah, so similar to what Lisa was saying, there is a lot of literature and studies, both neuroscience and developmental, that supports the development of the human brain continues through the mid and some would argue late 20s. And the time frame actually makes sense for a number of different ways. I mean, neuroscience wise, yes, but also developmentally, yes. So there's a lot of data to back up developmentally that during that time span, teenagers are developmentally wired to create their own identities, to form their own backgrounds, their unique experiences, and also to separate from their parents. And that's where you get the trope of, the teenager being rebellious and fighting against the parent in some sort of way. And it's not necessarily to be against the parent, but it's more to develop their own identity, their own viewpoints, their own opinions, which is really important for adult identity down the line.
Great, you guys, such important information. And I just want to reiterate, if anyone has questions along the way, you can put them in the Q&A. We will answer questions at the end, and we will try to answer them along the way as well. So the topic here is bullying, and is bullying the right word? I mean, I do know a few years ago, adults were using the word bullying and victim, and then some researchers did research and they were like, kids don't use that word, they use drama, different kinds of words. So is that the right word? Are there other words that might resonate more with young people? Then there's upstander and all these different terms. And it'd be great for one of you to define that if you feel comfortable. So let's start with that. I know that wasn't in my list of questions, but I'm throwing it out there. Either of you can jump. Do you want to jump in, Kevin?
I can jump in. Yeah. So I think when it comes to defining what bullying is, I think it's especially important to not only define what it is, but also to define what isn't bullying as well. Because I think it's important as people grow up to understand that this is bullying, but also this is normal conflict. This is a normal disagreement. This is a way that we can argue in a way that's healthy, just because we want to steer away from the concept of any sort of conflict is bad or some form of bullying or victimization, and that's not true. The concept of bullying can be defined with three main factors. One is that the behavior of bullying is unwanted and intentionally aggressive against the person who's being bullied. And then that bullying dynamic involves a dynamic that there's some sort of power dynamic, whether if it's physical size, whether if it's social status, whether if it's socioeconomic status, there's some element of power, whether if it's real or implied, is happening. And then that behavior repeats over a period of time. So there may be, one incident here, then another incident there, but then repeats. And this can occur in many different ways, in many different environments, the school, outside of school, online, social media, and I think it's important to note that these three factors are really important here, especially the part that's the unwanted and intentionally aggressive. There's an intentionality behind bullying that makes it particularly pernicious and dangerous for people who are experiencing it. It's not disagreeing over who won the soccer game or disagreeing about, whether you should wear these clothes versus that clothes, or do these clothes look good versus not good. It's much more intentional and harmful than that. And there was another point I was going to make. Oh yeah, so when it comes to labeling, so whether we use the word bullying versus something different, to be honest with me, I think we put a lot of emphasis on labels on a number of different levels for a number of different identities and situations. And I have a feeling maybe 20 years from now, we'll be describing the same thing with a different word, who knows? But I
Maybe
think
in
the
2
word
years.
bullying, or maybe 2 years, who knows?
Yeah.
But I think the word bullying, as long as we have a general understanding what that means, makes sense.
That's very important. Dr. Damour, Lisa?
So one of the ways I've written about this that grows off of what Kevin was sharing is that it is important that we make distinctions, as you're both saying, between bullying and conflict. And another way to define it is bullying is when a child or a group of kids are victimizing another kid who is unable to defend themselves, right? That when there's there's a helplessness here. And that's bullying versus conflict of kids not getting along, right? But able to defend themselves or not minding it too much or, withstanding it quite well. And Kevin and I are both clinicians, and we know how important it is to get the diagnosis right because the diagnosis drives the treatment.
Mhm.
And it's really important to make the proper diagnosis here because we actually treat these in two very different ways. Bullying requires very careful handling and, a very systematic approach. Conflict is about helping kids learn how to handle conflict well, use healthy forms of conflict versus unhealthy forms of conflict. And the metaphor that I've used in my writing is, it's like pneumonia versus the common cold. Conflict is the common cold of human interaction. Like if you're around other people, you're going to have conflicts and you're going to get colds. Bullying's like pneumonia. It is serious. It has to be treated. You use a very specific form of treatment. And so you want to really get this right before you decide what the next step is so that what you do works in terms of helping the kid as they work their way through it.
So, speaking of getting it right, one of the best places, I think, or one of a very important place is the home for the child to feel safe. And report after report says that many children, adolescents, don't tell anyone, any adult, about the bullying. They keep it to themselves. My own child told me, middle school had a few things happen, told me when they were in college, so I am certainly learning as I grow. Um, so how do you help? And I know this from the tech side of it because my expertise is media, technology, and adolescence. And I'm sure you guys know this as well. But how do you support the child and help them feel comfortable coming to you, either as an adult or as a teacher, or somebody in the child's life? Lisa, you go first this time.
Okay. Well, okay. I think obviously what is underlying this desire to keep the information is a sense of shame, right? And that is really, such a powerful, and I don't use this word very often, but toxic emotion that really gets in the way of getting the kind of support and connection that's deserved. So the kinds of things we want to do is actually create conditions where we make it clear to our child that they will not feel sorry that they let us know what's happening. I think that that's something that kids often, they know us well. And if they have any reason to think that we're going to go off half-cocked and pick up the phone and call the parent of the kid that is doing the thing, like they're not going to tell us. If in the past we have talked in a way about a kid who's on the receiving end of meanness in a way that suggests that we're not going to be that empathic, our kids have filed that away and they're not going to say anything to us. So the way that we lay the groundwork is in talking with our kids very openly about bullying before we think it's ever come up in their lives. So I'm the mother of a 20-year-old and a 13-year-old. And when my girls were young, I mean, 6, 7 years old, I said to them, listen, if you see anyone mistreating somebody in front of you, and this is the role of the upstander, you have to do one of three things. You have to bring that kid close to you. You have to tell the kid who's doing it to cut it out, or you need to get an adult. Like you must do one of those three things. You don't have to do all three. But I sort of opened the conversation about bullying at home in a sort of preventative way in terms of teaching them how to be upstanders, but also making it clear there's no shame for the child on the receiving end. We're actually here to help that child. So I think you lay the groundwork in that way. And then I think kids really are scared about what adults are going to do when we get delicate information. And so know that they are watching us very, very carefully. And if you sort of think, uh-oh, I may have picked up the phone a little too quickly in the past, it's probably worth revisiting that with your kid and saying, I think I may have picked up the phone a little too quickly in the past. Going forward, if there are things you want to tell me and not have me act right away, I promise you I won't.
I love that because, I think we often think we can't fix it or we can't repair. And admitting a mistake as a parent is actually quite
Mhm.
healthy and actually quite validating. It's showing your child perfection is not the goal. Like everyone can make mistakes. And what's much more important is that you are working to change and and you recognize when you've made a mistake. So you can repair, you can say I made a mistake, or and I'm going to try to do it differently. Kevin, do you have anything to add to the safe haven sort of question?
Yeah, I agree with what Lisa, mentioned in terms of, being there for the child and not necessarily there to intervene right away. I think a lot of it is relying on the child or teenagers kind of reaction or the fact that they're listening to you, what your reaction is going to be. But I have to mention, Brene Brown and her work on vulnerability and openness, and she actually talks about that concept a lot of admitting your mistakes to your children, why that is very important because, I'm a huge fan of the saying, perfection is the enemy of the good. So if we're in a position where we're vulnerable enough with our kids to say, well, I made this mistake, or I'm really sorry, I'll try this again next time. It's modeling good behavior for kids to accept that they are able to make mistakes and still worthy of love and belonging as human beings. But also, it's also okay to be open with you about this. I think it's also important too, in terms of safe home environments, that bullying at home is also taken care of as well, just like bullying at school. So like I said earlier, I work mostly with adults. And to be frank, the majority of traumatic stories I hear from many people that I work with aren't bullying from other kids, it's bullying from the parents, and also neglect from the parents, and so that tends to be a much more impactful relationship than any relationship with any kid in any school.
So important. And in fact, one of the comments talked about that. So I just want one of the reasons we put together this webinar was that the Center for Scholars and Storytellers worked with over 20 organizations for the Choose Kindness Project, where these organizations, including the Jed Foundation, are they all work in the sort of space of trying to support young people. And we pulled together 3 parenting playbooks, which we will put in the chat. They're free. One, two, and they're based on the excellent work by all these organizations and a few others as well, where we put up together steps to and conversation starters when your child is being bullied, when they are the bully, and also how to promote kindness and empathy before hopefully before these kinds of things happen. So as Lisa said, she started at a very young age, sort of giving her children tools before they sort of probably even knew what mean behavior is, although they do know at a pretty young age, but may not recognize it. And I love this. I'm going to read what Norm put in the chat. I recently heard of someone who, instead of asking their kids how school went today, they asked, "What did you do for someone today?" The positive feedback from their kids was delightful, thus motivating their kids to focus on kindness. What do you guys both think of that?
I love it. I mean, I love just, the level setting of what we're here for. I think that question of like, what did you do today can actually then become very preoccupied with what one did with one's own self today. And my husband's a high school teacher and he teaches at a Jesuit school where the motto of the school is men for others. It's an all boys high school. And I think it's a wonderful motto to sort of set the standard of like, we're here on behalf of other people and our job is to take care of one another. And so, I think there's ways we can create those cultures within our home with the kinds of things that we pay attention to.
I like it as well, but I want to add an asterisk to that. And it's the notion that while it is important that we do keep in mind, how we help other people, I also want to detract from I guess, the encouraging helping others at the expense of oneself. Because I think self-care is also really important as well. And I think it's important as we're asking this, it's okay to ask what we do for other people, but also how do we improve ourselves as well? What did we learn in school? What did we do in particular that was helpful for us in addition to other people?
Well, that's a really important point, and I think it's also great to give parents different questions to ask their kids on different days, so that aren't, and as a parent, it is sometimes very challenging to think about things. So both of these are great ideas. These playbooks that we created discuss working with your child to build empathy and a 4-step action plan. What do you guys both feel are some ways that we can help today's youth practice empathy, both for others and themselves? Go
Want to
ahead,
go first,
Lisa.
or?
You go first.
I
Oh, go,
missed.
Lisa.
Oh, okay, okay.
Go.
Um, well, this is something we start so young. This is something we start so young in our parenting. And especially if you have more than one child, they are not always kind to each other. That is absolutely to be sure. And so you can start early with kids, saying, do you see how upset your sister is? Do you understand why your sister is so upset? Can you connect with what you did with why your sister is so upset? I mean, the reality is, you know, in a home with more than one child, you get about 100 options a day for how you want to kind of go about building this kind of empathy and helping kids make a connection between how they behave and how it makes other people feel. Um, Now, you know, that's sometimes it doesn't, you know, it's not always true. And then of course there's play dates, you know, where you get to watch with young kids, watch how kids interact and can make the same sort of, you know, guiding points. I also think my favorite parenting guidance I ever saw um, was on the inside of a Dove chocolate wrapper. And what it said is, don't talk about it, be about it. So you can talk about empathy all day long, but if you're actually not very sensitive to your kids' needs, it like forget it. Like there's no point of even talking about it. So I think that a lot, if not all, of really where the transmission of, you know, behavioral guidelines and modeling how we want things done happens and how we care for one another. And it's what Kevin said, right? I mean, like preventing bullying often involves not having people mistreat their own kids, right? I mean, a lot of times when we see who's turning around and bullying, it's kids who've been treated poorly at home, you know? So I think going out of our way to involve our kids in our own empathic work, right? Of saying, you know what, it's your grandma's birthday coming up, and I've been thinking a lot about what would make her really happy, or she's not feeling well, and what can we do for her? You know, that's really where you're going to see development and growth is through the doing, not through the talking about it.
Which is means you really have to, you know, I mean, most of parenting actually is role modeling. You really
Mhm.
have to take a hard look in the mirror, and I know parenting is incredibly challenging. So self-care for yourself, but being intentional about how you communicate with your children and how you communicate to other adults as well. They will watch the way you communicate to others and may copy that. Kevin, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I not much to be honest with you. That's a really, really great demonstration of like how to build empathy, like kind of modeling it yourself. The main thing that I want to add is I'm a really huge fan of social justice advocacy in the context of this. You know, when it comes to doing social justice work, working with the homeless, helping people who are less advantaged or less privileged. You know, there are many organizations that help include those who are young and youth in helping people who are less privileged in other countries or in this one. You know, whether it's through religious institutions, through nonprofits, soup kitchens, all of that helps to build perspective as one grows and helps to understand the concept of privilege and how, despite one's background, whether it be, you know, racial, gender, etc., you know, we're all privileged in some sense of the word and in a position to help other people in some particular way. And to me, that helps build empathy to see, well, you know, this person may be going through this. And I think it's also important to note to the difference between empathy and sympathy, because, or pity rather, you know, so while looking down on people is one thing, empathy is not that. It's more identifying with someone else's struggles and seeing yourself in their shoes, or at least trying to. And sometimes the empathy lies in acknowledging that sometimes I may not be able to see things exactly from that person's perspective, but I can try, I can listen, I can try to understand, and then through that offer help and support as opposed to pity or bullying.
Absolutely. These are really all very important things. One thing I wanted to say about the cyberbullying, in particular, often when a parent or an adult finds out that their child is being cyberbullied, they think the solution is to take away the phone or the tech, and actually that it will backfire because that will stop the child from telling you, and that is one of, or even, you know, more to Lisa's point of talking about watching your reactions in the past. If your reaction around tech is always, this is bad, why are you on your phones, blah, blah, blah. You know, if something that a child might actually feel bad about or need some support on, but they're scared to go to you because you're going to take away the only thing that connects them with their peers. They, that is one thing that doesn't really work. And you should really be thinking about that. I don't know if either of you have anything to add. I'm sure more eloquently than I shared that info.
Yeah, yeah, I do. So this is actually how bullying in the 21st century is so different than bullying in the last, several hundred years. The notion not just that there are these new platforms where bullying can take place, but also understanding too that this generation, which we're gearing towards Generation Alpha being in this age group, as Gen Z gets older and older, the notion that Gen Alpha grew up in a time where technology is around all the time, in my generation, so I'm a millennial. We're pushing 40 now, or many of us are past 40, and many parents are actually in my age range versus a little bit more. Many of us grew up at a time where there's no technology or cell phones. We may have been introduced to it growing up, but the concept of it being essential isn't really part of our psyche necessarily as it is for someone who is in Gen Z or Gen Alpha. I think Gen Alpha is those who were born above, I think, 1999, or no, that's not true. In the
No, I
2000s of
think
some
that is
sort.
it. It's
Oh
around
yeah,
then. Yeah,
1999. Yeah. So in order to be mindful of that, I think it's important that as we're thinking with cyberbullying, taking away technology is essentially taking away something that is needed for someone to function, and not necessarily in terms of an addiction per se, because there is a such thing as an addiction to cyber technology. There's more and more literature growing on that. But schools are basing much of their lessons on technology now. Much of how we learn to communicate and interact with others are online and through the internet. That's how many people are learning to develop communication skills with others. So just taking it away really isn't an option anymore.
absolutely. Um, so we have a lot of great questions, and I'd like to go to some of those, but I'm going to ask you each, what is one thing that you want parents to take away from this conversation when it comes to supporting youth being bullied, or who may be with a bully, or even just watching it? What sort of, or maybe I should wait till later. Well, I'm going to do it now. Go ahead, Lisa. What's like one, like your big sort of like, please, this is what I want you to hear.
What I want people to hear is that if you think bullying is happening, move slowly. You want to collect a lot of information. You want to get good information. You do not want to react too quickly or overreact. So if you have reason to think that your child is being bullied, the first thing I would have you do is probably reach out to someone else somewhere who could have seen what's happening or who can get to the bottom of it. So make a very contained and polite call to the school and say, I am hearing this. I don't know really what's happening. I know I'm only hearing my kid's side of the story. Do you have more information? Can you get more information? Can you help me sort this out? So go very slowly, treat the school, unless you have reason to otherwise, like they're going to be a great partner in this. They want to be a great partner. Many states, I think actually all 50 states now require schools to address bullying by law. Um, what I can tell you, having practiced for 30 years, is that there have been times where a kid came into my office saying, You're not going to believe how I'm being talked to. And they show, like, I'm being bullied, mistreated. And they show me the text thread, and I see what they're talking about. But I'm like, Is this you right here? Right. And what they're saying is really not nice at all. And, they're teenagers. They don't always have, or kids, they don't always have a clean, neutral perspective on their own part in things. So true bullying happens, there's no question, but there's also kids who are much more aware of what's being done to them than necessarily owning their side of the story. And the way I have seen this go really badly is when a parent, of course, lovingly, hears from their kid, picks up the phone, calls the other parent and starts, being very angry with them. And the other parent's like, you don't know what, like, your kid did to my kid. I mean, it just blows it up in the worst possible way. So you don't know what you're looking at. Move slowly, because what I have seen is well-meaning parents making things worse when they're already pretty challenging. And bullying can be addressed. It can be done very, very well, but it needs to be done systematically because the chances of intervening in a way that actually exacerbates the problem are very high. So you don't want to do that.
Kevin.
I'm going to circle back on the empathy concept actually, because when it comes to practicing empathy as a model for your kids is super important. A lot of this stems from my work with transgender and gender diverse teenagers who face a lot of bullying in school, but are so afraid to talk about it because they're worried about what their parents are going to think when it comes to their identities. A lot of the research shows abysmal levels of depression, anxiety disorders, suicide among those who are LGBT, particularly the transgender diverse populations. And one of the studies or actually several studies, have shown that one big factor that lowers those levels of risk is parental support in the household. And I see a lot of hope in the younger generation compared to the generations compared to my generation, actually, because there's a lot more acceptance about different identities, whether if it's racial, gender-related, sexual orientation, and that's helps in terms of well, these folks may actually have a chance growing up in an environment where they're secure to be themselves. However, this may not necessarily be the case back at home. And I think it's especially important to create an environment where if they're being bullied for something that they are uncomfortable with, but they're unable to talk to their own parents about that, then what do they do?
Yeah. And I think actually for trans children in particular or young people, um, the news in the United States is also a
Mhm.
form of bullying. And it is incredibly traumatic for them because they feel that there's no place for them, perhaps right now, the
Mhm.
coasts. But so really understanding that it is just hard for a child who is thinking about this, who and many children identify as gender fluid. A quarter of Gen Z
Mhm.
identifies as queer. So this is something that you may, as a parent, not think will happen in your own home, but it may. So it's very important to really think about how you're talking about this, how the world is communicating about this, because this generation is really sort of thinking much more deeply about all the different labels, as you said, Kevin, and rejecting these labels. And the more that we can be empathetic as adults to their experience, the more we can support them and help them grow up healthy and as best to our abilities. So I'm going to start pulling up some questions. I don't know if we can answer this. Maybe if one of you, can you please discuss the behavior and generational effects of bullying in gangs? I'm not sure. I can't answer that, but do either of you feel like you have some information around that?
I don't feel like I know enough of the research to speak with confidence about it. Kevin, do you have a knowledge base here?
I don't think I'm just racking my brain to see if I've read anything lately about it or experienced that clinically, and I guess fortunately I haven't. So yeah, I can't either, unfortunately.
How do you recommend an elementary school use this resource? I'm assuming you're talking about the Choose Kindness Project playbook, which we are hopefully going to get trying to figure out how to put that in the chat with this Q&A format, but we'll hopefully send them also afterwards. But there is also in their teacher resource on that link. So you can find an educator resource, and then there's ways for the parents to talk to the school as well. So I'm sure both of you will have a good answer to this. Is there a place for the arts and the humanities in these discussions? I personally love that question because we're the center for scholars and storytellers. So what do you all think?
Well, of course, and it's wonderful. And what's really cool is how you can do this developmentally and that you can really choose different stories and different narratives at different ages to get to questions of friendship and bullying and conflict and what the right thing to do is. And I'm a clinical psychologist, and one of the ways we talk about doing therapy with younger kids, especially, is we talk about the term displacement. That you can't just put a kid on the spot and be like, "How are you feeling?" Right? But you can say, "I wonder how this kid over here is feeling," as we think about this particular scenario. So taking it just one step removed from a direct conversation with young people can often help them open up quite a bit. And of course, this is, incredibly extraordinary work done by Facing History, does incredible work of using, um, you know, historical stuff, literature to really, really help students think in profound ways about bullying at both small and large scale.
And they were one of the groups in the Alliance their work inform these books.
So my sister's an English teacher in the state of Texas. So yes, first of all, absolutely, there is a role for arts and humanities when it comes to building empathy, for targeting bullying, the effects of bullying, the effects of the human experience. Part of the challenge is in the process of selecting which arts and humanities are being used for the children. And there is a concerning amount of legislation and regulation that is pulling back on helpful literature arts that can be essentially helpful, but may appear too controversial to be used. Particularly books relating to LGBT content, or even books that have anything to do with race, that are being moved from classrooms that help to build empathy and support for those who are different from them. Uh, you know, and and so I think part of it is intervening in schools to get a sense of what arts and humanities are actually being taught in the classrooms. Is it something that is diverse and broad enough to help build a background of understanding, cultural understanding, but also working directly with the kid or teenager in terms of like, well, what are you reading? What is this about? Oh, I remember reading this when I was in high school. Here's what I got from this. Or even exposure outside the school to arts and humanities as well, to plays, ballets, art performing, depending on where you are, location wise, of course. But that's also important as well. I think the exposure to the arts and humanities shouldn't just rely with the school alone.
I have a
Absolutely. And go ahead.
so there's actually on the empathy piece, Kevin, you made me think about it. What we know is actually literature can help build empathy. That if you give a sort of a historical account, say maybe of slavery, it's an intellectualized experience. But if you read a story that is evocative and even upsetting, maybe especially if it really moves you, it actually helps to foster empathy. And so, you know, that's one of the ways we think about, how we help kids grow is actually giving them developmentally appropriate literature that expands their humanity by making them uncomfortable. And I think,
Yeah.
you know, Kevin talked about the banning of books, which is, its own special, terrible situation. But there's also even in some schools an effort to only have kids read stuff that they don't find upsetting. And that's also something that, if it's, there's content that's unmanageable versus content that's uncomfortable, kids should not be given unmanageable content. But I will stick up for giving content to kids that actually makes them uneasy and helps them expand their humanity, because we actually have research literature showing that it works that way.
And actually, as that is my expertise, how entertainment media can support the social and emotional well-being of young people. So not only to help them have perspective taking and understand a different point of view and having uncomfortable conversations, frankly, if you are a parent, sometimes you can use media just in the way Lisa was talking about in a clinical setting. You can say, what does that character think? I personally use 13 Reasons Why, and my child shared incredible things with me because she watched that with me. But you can also help them be seen. I mean, it's an incredible tool for a young person who is maybe not exposed to, different kinds of communities that look like them or act like them or behave like them. And they see a piece, they read something, they see something on socials, or, and all of a sudden a whole new world can open up. So I completely believe in arts and humanities as a way to support young people's health and well-being. Um, Kristen Danny says bullying at home is far different than bullying at school. I would argue that bullying at home is possibly potentially abuse. Regarding bullying at school, sometimes educators are so worried about bullying that there is little room for allowing children to experience and practice conflict resolution. What would you suggest in balancing bullying versus conflict resolution? I'll start with you, Lisa.
So the first thing I would suggest, as a thank you for this important question, is having everybody get clear on the distinctions between the two. And basically saying, if you think there's bullying, then the adults need to be right in there, intervening, separating kids, managing it very well. Conflict resolution is one of my favorite things in the whole world to teach. And once you've sort of addressed what bullying is and where it needs to be handled, then you can really get into, a rolled up sleeves programming around conflict resolution. And I've written about this in my book Under Pressure, and then I wrote a piece for the Times on this about helping tweens and teens handle social conflict. But the bottom line, I'll just give you a quick highlight of this. I say to kids, there's three kinds of unhealthy conflict. You see them all the time, and there's a couple kinds of healthy conflict. The metaphors for unhealthy conflict, being a bulldozer, running people over, being a doormat, letting yourself get run over, or most common, being a doormat with spikes, which is basically passive aggressive behavior. And then I break it down using guilt as a weapon, playing the part of a victim, involving third parties in what should be a two-party dispute. One of the most fun things you can do is get a pack of seventh graders to give you examples of these things. They are incredibly funny and incredibly good at just giving you this in real living color. And then you say, okay, now that we've gotten that out of our system, if you're going to have a conflict, kids don't always have to have a conflict, they might decide to drop it. Then you're going to do it as a pillar. You're going to stand up for yourself while being respectful of the other person. If you give kids a chance to give examples, they are phenomenal at this. And then I say, you know, not all conflicts are worth it. And we talk through when it's worth it and when it's not. All functioning adults are making very tactical decisions about when to have conflicts. We can help kids do the same. And then I say to them, if you decide it's not worth it, use what we clinicians call emotional Aikido, which is the person coming at you, just dodge and let them keep going. You do not have to engage it. This is not the same as being a doormat. This is making a tactical decision to not have conflict. Now, the thing I love is you can start these conversations with little kids. And I have found, having done this clinically and also in schools, kids hold on, like these metaphors are hugely sticky. 6 years later, kids have come to me like, yep, I did not doormat with spikes once in high school, though I desperately wanted to. It is fantastic. So you can teach conflict all day, but you first have to dispatch with the question of what is bullying and who handles it.
I love that, Kevin.
That's wonderful. It's hard to follow that. So I think we mentioned this a little earlier when it comes to the term bullying, and also, because I really like the distinction that Kristen made in her question about, bullying versus abuse, but also throwing trauma into the mix as well. And the impacts of all through, really how they can overlap, some certain differences between the three and how they can appear. But yeah, I agree too in terms of getting a sense of what is what and defining, in terms of defining what is what, but also how to interact or to not interact, but to respond to that. So just going back to the concept of conflict and behavior that isn't bullying, I think it's also important to distinguish too that even though some behaviors may not be bullying, it could still be mistakes. So for example, a child who doesn't want to share their toys. They're not being a bully, but they may benefit from some education about when to be sharing is a good thing to make friends or interact with other folks, or to have perspective about being open or empathetic to others who may have less than they do. There's also the concept too of when it comes to just going back to the concept of self-care and managing one's own uh, boundaries, because that's also really important as well. In fact, I find myself working with a lot of adults who never really had the opportunity as children, teenagers to learn that setting healthy boundaries is not bullying, it's not abuse, it's self-care, and what that looks like. So telling someone no or saying, I'm sorry, I can't help you, is not bullying, it's not abuse, it's taking care of yourself, and that's okay. You're not inflicting harm on someone by saying no.
I think that thinking about trauma is really important, and having actually some empathy, especially as an adult, for the young person. I think about my neighbor. There was a young woman who was very popular, everyone's friend, and then all of a sudden she turned into a bully, and everybody was very upset. Turned out her parents were getting divorced. Hurt people. And I think, we sometimes people jump to the conclusion that that person is a bad person. They're doing this to them. And as an adult anyway, especially if it's a young person, if you can try to get to have some understanding as to where this negative behavior might be coming from. um Ultimately the person doing it might feel seen and might understand that the behavior isn't necessarily the right answer for what they're feeling. um
Actually, I want to add to
would
that real quick because I really
Yeah.
appreciate you mentioning that. And that's why I really like the one of the playbooks is focused on the person who's doing the bullying, and
Mhm.
where that bullying can come from. Because I do feel that sometimes kids or us or grow up in environments where there is an all bad person or an all good person, when in essence we're all human people. So we all make mistakes. There may be reasons why we make those mistakes, and we have to learn from those mistakes. And so I think while there may be a lot of talk about the person being bullied and how to support them, which is really important, I think it's also important to talk about the bullier, why they could be bullying other people, and how to help them think about the world in different ways to stop that
Especially when
behavior.
they're young, because if they're labeled
Hmm.
as bad, it
Yep.
self-perpetuates, and then they may have never sort of learned the skill set to choose a different path.
To
Um,
that point, actually, I consulted to one school in my community for 20 years, so I got to see this huge long arc of development. And there were seventh graders who really were not at their best selves. Definitely, acting in ways that were really not okay, who turned into like the greatest 10th graders ever. And so I really have tried to be very careful about the use of terms bully or mean girls, like they're very sticky terms. And so if you're going to use them, keep it tight, be careful, don't talk about it in the community. And because kids also get a chance, deserve a chance to grow and change. And not only does it kind of become part of how they become defined as an identity, it can also just become a label that they can't shake. And that's really not giving them a fair chance.
and it's, I mean, it's important at any age and stage, but particular when someone is young because they've got the rest of their lives ahead of them. Would love to hear how to support kids in the counseling and or school setting. Both of you guys are in these with choosing kindness. I'm currently working in a middle school as a therapist, and it's been challenging, particularly for kiddos presenting with neurodivergence. Really important question.
Why don't I take it first from the non-neurodivergent side, just in terms of kids in middle school and right now? I will tell you, things have been pretty rough post-pandemic. That there was, always unkindness happening in schools prior to the pandemic, and I have certainly observed in my clinical work and my work with schools, it's heightened in the wake of the pandemic. And I think, this stands to reason. Kids were very anxious about their social connections. They sometimes make connections by boxing other kids out. And the thing that's actually come on the scene big in schools is like friendship groups and the importance of having a friendship group. And I am hearing more misery around friendship groups than I've ever heard in my 30 years of caring for teenagers. And a lot of what's happening is that kids are sort of consolidating these friendship groups and then kind of cruelly kicking kids out who somehow don't seem to fit so cleanly into what they're picturing. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in schools right now around helping kids have a higher tolerance for one another. Kids are very low tolerance for kids who don't fit their, who rub them the wrong way. And also for helping kids understand that they don't have to like everybody, but they do need to be considerate of everybody. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make because a lot of kids have gotten this idea of like, I need to be authentic. And if I don't like that kid, I got to tell them. And you're like, you actually don't have to tell them. You can tell your folks, you can tell your best friend quietly, but you're going to need to be considerate in public. And I think those kinds of things can help. And then with a kid who has neurodivergence, which of course is a giant tent, can mean a lot of different things, sometimes those concrete guidelines are really handy to say like, oh, you don't have to like them, but you know, considerate or polite, those are the minimal expectations.
Kevin, can you speak to neurodivergence? I know a lot of trans kids identify as neurodivergent.
Yeah, yes, many do. There's actually quite a few studies that show that many who are trans are more likely to be neurodivergent than in general public. Though unfortunately, I don't have much clinical experience, particularly with those who are adolescents. For those who are 30, yes. But Lisa mentioned a really great comment earlier that I just want to build on, the notion that simply because you don't like somebody, or simply because you don't want to include someone doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be open about that particular thing. In fact, there's a saying that's used a lot in the recovery community, actually. Honesty without compassion is cruelty.
Ooh, I like that.
So
I
yeah, so
like
the
that.
yeah, I mean it's when I
Yeah.
heard it's like, oh, that's interesting. So the notion of building compassion is really, really important, even if it involves things that you don't like, or but that's the compassion is super important.
I love that. Okay,
Actually, I will put in a plug. So on my podcast, we almost always answer questions from parents, but a few weeks ago, we answered a question from a 14-year-old in the UK who wrote the most gorgeous question of like, how do I move on from this friend? Like, we don't want to hurt her, but we don't want to hang out with her anymore. And so my co-host and I unpacked it for 25 minutes, and it's a real challenge because kids, their friendships are growing and changing, they are growing and changing, and they do need help moving on in a
We
way that
all
is
need help
not
with that.
cruel. Yeah. But so that's available as a resource.
Okay, you got to give that to us and we'll try to drop it in or send it
Okay, let me see if
afterwards.
I can
Or
find it.
we
Yeah.
put your page on the
Okay, good.
deck.
It's a great place to
Uh,
look for resources.
so one last question, which I personally like a lot. Do you think well, I think it'll be interesting what we say, and I'm going to answer first, sorry. Do you think the lack of physical spaces outside of school for kids and teens to socialize has decreased ways for kids to naturally learn conflict resolution? And in fact, we just published a study called Teens and Screens that went viral in late October. And our Gen Z authors wrote about media being the third space, the first space being home, the second space being work or school, the third space used to be malls and churches and all these different things. And media really has taken that place. So, and I do think you can learn conflict resolution through media. But I do agree it's probably a lot more challenging, and it has to be much more intentional. I mean, when you cannot see the person's face, when you cannot see the context, when you cannot see the other people, it may be very, very challenging to really understand that your words hurt. So I do think that is a really important and actually a really interesting research question, which I'm 100% sure anyone has tested that. I think it would be really, really interesting to talk about that a little bit more. Lisa, anything, or
Well,
Kevin, you want to add?
I think social skills are like skills. They need practice. Like, you have to practice a skill to be better at it. And part of why we have seen such roughness in the wake of the pandemic is that kids lost 18 months of practicing how to be with one another. And so, the idea of there being spaces where kids can be in person, where there's an adult somewhere nearby, but they're practicing being social, is going to help them be more skilled in that. And if they're not getting practice, they're not going to be as good at it.
So I'm thinking about skills and what exactly is a skill. So there's this meme or cartoon that I saw that says an IQ test for certain animals, and the IQ test is whoever climbs this tree the fastest is the smartest person. And you have a monkey, you have an elephant, you have a fish, you have so I guess what is considered a helpful skill depends on what environment you're living in and how one can apply to it. And I think it's important to note that we are living or in a world that is becoming increasingly virtual. The Meta is starting to grow as a company to building more and more experiences of virtual reality. When social media pops up in newer and newer spaces, and you have like the MySpace, and you have YouTube, then you have Facebook, then you have TikTok, or
Yeah.
but the probably orders all over, and there's probably other media things I've never even heard of because I'm old. So it's I think it's important as people are gaining skills that they're gaining a skill set for what they need. And so being able to communicate virtually is a skill that some of us have and some of us don't. Now, I think the challenge is, you're right, like after the pandemic, or at least during the pandemic, there's a situation where an opportunity for social interaction face to face has been turned off. However, the opportunities for virtual interaction grew in a number of different ways among people of all generations. I'm just thinking about before the pandemic, the amount of telehealth encounters I had was next to zero. Whereas now I'd say a good 60-70% of my clinical encounters are telehealth, for better or for worse, because there are pros and cons to both. But so I think part of the challenge is in our society, is face-to-face communication, how important it is. And I do believe that it is important to have face-to-face communication skills. But, given the direction of our society, is that the only skill that's important, or is it also important to dedicate time to developing skills communicating virtually too? Um,
Absolutely.
I mean, you
Yeah.
said earlier about the notion that, well, people can type and say whatever they want without the thought of maybe I'm hurting other people. That's an important skill to understand. Like I am typing this comment, maybe I'm anonymous, but I can still hurt other people, and that's still wrong. And I need to be aware of that.
That is also why it's so important to teach that skill, because when someone is coming online onto and it doesn't really, your brain hasn't developed enough to really understand the social cues that are all out there. And, you're putting these words and, I remember my daughter put something in Ask FM, which is this question and answer thing, and the comments came back really in my adult brain as mean. She didn't even realize it, and these are the kinds of things that it takes a while to learn. And I want to just say face to face, I am not saying face to face versus not face to face, because we are kind of face to face, even if it's virtual. I'm saying face to face in person. So just sharing that, because I think that is more descriptive of the two different ways that we're communicating, or in person or not in person. Okay, well, we don't have time to answer everything, but thank you all for the privilege of your time. We look forward to welcome you back on Tuesday. I won't be here, but Wendy Kelman and Vicki Goodman will be on March 21st at 4 p.m. PT for an open mind with Dr. Julie Smith. She's an internationally renowned psychologist, social media influencer, and the author of Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before? And she'll be joined in discussion by Dr. Robert Bilder, distinguished professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences and psychology, and chief of the division of psychology. That is a long title. From all of us at the Center for Scholars and Storytellers, the Friends of Semmel, and the Resnick Boards, and the Choose Kindness Project, we wish you a good evening. Stay safe and well, and see you back here on March 12th. I want to thank Dr. Damour. I want to thank Dr. Johnson. This was an incredible discussion. You guys keep doing the great work you're doing, and thank you for giving us your time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.